Best news ever, guys.
Where are you?
This is Mrs. Klein.
And Mr. Creighton. We are here with your last podcast of this unit. It's Lesson 7, The Decline of Feudalism. So the guiding question that we'll be looking at, that hopefully you guys can answer at the end of this, is how did events in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought?
All right, you guys, there are some vocabulary terms for this lesson. They are bubonic plague, habeas corpus, heretic, 100 Years' War, Magna Carta, and model parliament.
All right, guys, before we get started, just know that you can follow along in the textbook on page 87, and I believe it goes to 93. There we go.
Perfect.
All right, so looking at the introduction, several key events contributed to the decline of feudalism in Europe from the 12th century through the 15th centuries. You will explore three of these causes: political changes in England, a terrible disease, and a long series of wars.
All right, in England, several political changes in the 12th and 13th centuries helped to weaken feudalism. A famous document known as the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, dates from this time.
In the 1300s, a terrible disease called the bubonic plague, or Black Death, swept across Asia and reached Europe in the late 1340s.
All right, lastly, between 1337 and 1453, France and England fought a series of battles known as the 100 Years' War.
How did such different events contribute to the decline of feudalism? What social and political changes occurred as feudalism weakened? In this lesson, you will find out.
All right, you guys, we're moving on to the first section, which is political developments in England. Political development was rampant during the Middle Ages, and in one country, England, developments during the 12th and 13th century helped to weaken feudalism. The story begins with King Henry II, who reigned from 1154 to 1189.
Henry made legal reform a central concern for his reign. Cases were then tried before a royal judge. Cases were then tried before a royal judge. In theory, people could no longer simply be jailed or executed for no legal reason, but had to go through a court trial as well. These reforms strengthened the power of royal courts at the expense of feudal lords.
Henry's efforts to strengthen royal authority led to a serious conflict with the Catholic Church.
Henry's actions led to a long, bitter quarrel with his friend, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1170, four knights, perhaps seeking the king's favor, killed Becket in front of the main altar of Canterbury Cathedral.
Okay, now we're going to move on in 1199 to find out a little bit about King John and the Magna Carta. In 1199, Henry's youngest son John became King of England. John soon made powerful enemies by losing most of the lands the English had controlled in France.
In June 1215, angry nobles forced a meeting with King John in a meadow called Runnymede beside the River Thames, outside of London. There they insisted that John put his seal on a document called Magna Carta, which means Great Charter in Latin.
All right. The Magna Carta was an agreement between the nobles and the monarch. The nobles concurred that the monarch could continue to rule. For his part, King John agreed to observe common law and the traditional rights of the nobles and the church.
He also agreed that no free man could be jailed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This idea eventually developed into a key part of English common law known as habeas corpus.
All right, you guys, and we can be thankful for that because we've got that same concept in our legal system here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
All right, in many ways, the Magna Carta only protected the rights and privileges of nobles. However, as time passed, the English people came to regard it as one of the foundations of their rights and liberties.
All right, moving forward to model parliament. In 1295, Edward I, King John's grandson, took a major step toward including more people in government. Edward called together a governing body called the Model Parliament that included commoners and lower-ranking clergy, as well as high-level church officials and nobles.
All right, so you guys, there were some impacts of political developments in England. These political changes contributed to the decline of feudalism in two ways. Some of the changes strengthened royal authority at the expense of the nobles. Others eventually shifted some power to the common people.
Magna Carta established the idea of rights and liberties that even a monarch cannot violate.
All these ideas formed the basis for the development of modern democratic institutions.
All right, guys, looking at section 2, this is the bubonic plague. Another reason for the decline of feudalism was the bubonic plague, which affected all of Europe. The bubonic plague first struck Europe from 1346 to 1351.
Historians suspect that the plague began in Central Asia, possibly in China, and spread throughout China, India, the Middle East, and eventually to Europe.
All right, the Black Death, which is another name for the bubonic plague. Symptoms or signs of the plague included fever, vomiting, fierce coughing and sneezing fits, and egg-sized swellings of bumps called buboes.
Oh God, buboes, man. Like that
Buboes.
does not sound really appealing, an egg-sized swelling. Yikes. The dirty conditions in which people lived contributed significantly to the spread of the bubonic plague.
Terrified people falsely blamed the plague on everything from the positions of the planets to lepers and to Jews.
All right, they were to find out a little bit about the impact of the plague. Some historians estimate that 24 million Europeans died of the plague, about a third of the entire population. The deaths of so many people accelerated or sped up changes in Europe's economic and social structure, which contributed to the decline of feudalism.
After the plague, there was a shift in power from nobles to the common people. One reason for this change was a desperate need for workers because so many people had died.
Okay. After the plague, a number of peasant rebellions broke out. When nobles tried to return to the system from before the plague, resentment exploded all across Europe.
All right, guys, looking at the final section, which is the 100 Years' War. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France fought a series of battles for control over lands in France. Known as the 100 Years' War, this long conflict contributed to the erosion of feudalism in England and in France.
English monarchs had long claimed land in France. This was because earlier English kings had actually been feudal lords over these French fiefs. French kings now disputed these claims.
Despite often being outnumbered, the English won most of the early battles of the war.
All right, but the French fight back. The French slowly chipped away at the territory that the English had won in the early years of the war.
Another reason for increased French resistance was a new sense of national identity and unity. In part, the French were inspired by a 17-year-old peasant girl known today as Joan of Arc.
In 1429, Joan led a French army to victory in the Battle of Orleans. The following year, the Maid of Orleans was captured by English allies. The English pushed certain church leaders to accuse Joan of being a witch and a heretic, and to burn her at the stake.
Joan of Arc's heroism changed the way many French men and women felt about their king and nation.
All right, so let's find out a little bit about the impact of the 100 Years' War. Okay, the 100 Years' War contributed to the decline of feudalism by helping to shift power from feudal lords to monarchs and to common people.
In addition, changes in military technology reduced the need for nobles, knights, and castles.
The new feeling of nationalism also shifted power away from lords.
The war created a new sense of national unity and patriotism on both sides.
All right, you guys, in this lesson, we've explored 3 key events that contributed to the decline of feudalism in Europe in the late Middle Ages.
All right, first taking a look at political developments in England. Henry II's legal reforms strengthened English common law and the role of judges and juries. Magna Carta established the idea of rights and liberties that even a monarch cannot violate. It also affirmed that monarchs should rule with the advice of the governed. Edward I's model parliament gave a voice to government to common people as well as to nobles.
All right, we also found out about the bubonic plague. The plague killed about 1/3 of the people of Europe. After the plague, the need for workers to rebuild Europe led to a slight shift in power from feudal lords to the common people, because those guys could say, hey, you want me to work on your farm, you better pay me a little bit more.
Yeah, and remember, the majority of people were the commoners.
Yes, they were.
All right, finally, the 100 Years' War. This series of battles between England and France caused a rise in national pride and identity in both countries. It strengthened the monarchs and began to reduce the importance of nobles and knights on the battlefield.
All right, you guys, so just remember, there are those vocabulary terms: bubonic plague, habeas corpus, heretic, 100 Years' War, Magna Carta, and model parliament.
And the guiding question you should be able to answer now: how did events in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought? Wah, wah.